Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast is brought to you by Compassion International. A chance for you to release a child from poverty is made possible because of the great work being done at Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. For more information about how you can release a child from poverty, visit their website, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Pray about it, talk to your family, see if there's an opportunity for you to make room for one more at your dinner table by sponsoring a child through Compassion. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. Today on the podcast, we bring you the very powerful story of Stephen Elliott. Stephen joined the military in 2003, served as a member of the elite 75th Ranger Regiment, and in 2004 he was deployed to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. In the midst of an enemy ambush, he was one of 4 Rangers who mistook Pat Tillman's position for that of the enemy and fired there. He is one of 2 Rangers considered likely to have fired the fatal shots. And Elliott served the remaining years of his enlistment and returned to civilian life in 2007. And he's written this book. It's called War Story. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. And I'll just read to you what it says on the cover of this book, and it kind of takes us into the conversation that we have with Stephen. It says, "Many of us have a war story, a story of struggle, pain, and loss. We leave these battles forever changed, and the wounds we bear may not be easily seen. This is one man's war story, a story of the tragic death of NFL player turned Army Ranger Pat Tillman, told by the soldier who may have killed him, of the shooting's aftermath that plunged him into the depths of guilt, shame, and addiction until unlikely hope emerged, of a man who began fighting for his country and found himself fighting for his soul." Take a listen to the powerful conversation of Stephen Elliott, the author of the book War Story, here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. First of all, I'll start with thank you for your service, being a member of the elite 75th Ranger Regiment, and just really appreciate all you've done to serve and to protect our country. So thank you for your service. We're really excited to have you here. Before we dive deep into the book, because there's such a large amount of your story, I think that a lot of people may not know about, and a lot of people might remember hearing about, but not quite sure about all of it. But let's start with just learning about you and yourself growing up. What was life like, where you grew up, time as a kid into your teen years, and just take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I'm from a small town in central Kansas called Hays, Kansas. If you've ever stopped for gas between Kansas City and Denver, you probably know it well. But other than that, probably not. But that's where I grew up. All my family are in some form or fashion attached to agriculture or the oil business. And I grew up in that small town, and then went to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to study business. And I had never, I played my fair amount of G.I. Joe as a kid. My grandfather, who was kind of the closest thing I had to a dad in my life, he had spent a year and a half on the Italian front in World War II as an artilleryman. And so I grew up around him and a lot of other of his peers who, odds were veterans. And that was very much kind of an assumed just part of the family dynamic. As I grew older, I didn't really harbor any ambitions towards military service. I was actually moving more seriously towards wanting to go to law school. And I was kind of ticking along at ORU, got there in 99, and then 9/11 happened, beginning of my junior year. Yeah. And that definitely kind of started the wheels spinning in a very different trajectory for me in terms of what am I here for, and what am I going to do with my life as you contemplate finishing your degree and moving on. And so that's just a little bit of my background leading up to my time in the military.
I know you became a Christian at a very young age. As I was reading your book and you described when your faith kind of began for you, you were really young. And I wonder if you could share kind of the faith dynamic growing up as a believer and kind of how that took shape for you.
Yeah, it was interesting because both of my parents were raised in the same small. Like I grew up at Hays, Kansas, is a town of about 20,000 people. That is a metropolis compared to where my folks grew up, which is Natoma, Kansas, of a town of about 500 people at its apex in the 1960s.
Wow!
And so pretty quaint. They were in the same high school graduating class, same very conservative Lutheran church. And so it was an incredibly, I came to understand it as an incredibly heartfelt, stoic, buttoned down sort of expression of the faith. And my mom and my dad, they were divorced shortly after I was born. And that was a pretty rough time just in general for a lot of reasons. I mean, divorce obvious, and there's a lot of things underlying that. Just that there's a lot of hurt and a lot of just relational destruction even beyond the divorce. But my mom herself, I think she would say she kind of had a crisis of faith. She would say that, no slight to my grandparents, that she had a sense of religion. She had been baptized, raised, confirmed in the Lutheran church, but she would say that during that time she didn't know Jesus. And so she came to know the Lord, during that time when I was an infant. And then she became basically, and she's a pretty dynamic lady. She's senior sales director with Mary Kay Cosmetics and has been doing that for about 40 years. And she was essentially just looking for wherever she felt the Spirit of the Lord was moving. And so we left the Lutheran church when I was an infant, and that didn't go over super well. And so we, looking back, like we experienced just lots of different expressions of the church, whether it was within, charismatic denominations, whether it was in Methodist churches, Catholic churches, people's homes. I saw and experienced a pretty wide spectrum of people and different cultures just trying to follow the Lord. And so that's certainly a lot to that, but that was sort of what my experience was like growing up. And so, when I'm 4 years old and, I told my mom that, I want to follow Jesus. She just said, well, you should tell him that.
Yeah.
And so there was no intermediary, and that's the beautiful thing about the gospel is that we have authority, we have mentors, we have people who go before us that we can learn from, but he's right there, and he's ready to listen and ready to respond. And so that was so blessed with that heritage that she gave me in just seeking the Lord, because that was really my upbringing.
Stephen Elliott is our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. His book is called War Story. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. And I know you mentioned 9/11, how poignant that was for you. And most of us, I guess, age 25 and older now, which is kind of crazy to think how many years ago that was, yeah. Almost 18 years ago. But 25 or older, most of us remember exactly where we were and kind of the influence that day had on us personally. You were in college. You mentioned Oral Roberts, and you didn't graduate till 2003. But tell me about, go a little deeper here with the effect of 9/11, maybe where you were and kind of what effect it had on you in terms of thinking about going into the military.
Yeah. When 9/11 happened, I was in bed because it was, college schedule. It was a day I didn't have classes, and I was, sleeping in. And
sure.
a friend of mine woke me up and said, in the most understated fashion possible, there's something on TV you should probably take a look at. And didn't have any, watched those events unfold, and had no container, no context for them. They felt very, very distant. You're in Oklahoma, and this is happening in Manhattan. Yet academically, that it's happening on U.S. soil. So intellectually, that feels like that's a big deal. But I think the interesting thing was, over the next couple of days, just realizing how small the world is. I mean, we all live in our own little enclaves doing our own thing. And we, even back then in the dark ages before social media, you don't realize how close you are to just the world. Yeah. And, hearing, all of a sudden classmates and friends who are, frantically trying to get a hold of family in New York. And a good friend of mine who, I lived next door to him in the dorms my freshman year. He was in the World Trade Center in training with a wealth management firm on 9/11. And he made it out. He was okay. But then all of a sudden, something that was, 1,800 miles away became just very personal. And I was fortunate. I didn't have any, friends or family that I lost in that tragedy, but it just kind of hit home real quick. And then from there, it was sort of a lot of things came back for me. Just I think I'd always seen. I had so much respect for my grandfather and others who had served in World War II in Korea, Vietnam, and I think. Even though I had, really good family foundations, I think there was kind of two things that started kicking in for me. One was, I saw the next 30 plus years of my life in an office flash before my eyes. And I was just like, I don't know if I want to do that. Yeah. And if I am going to serve, now is the time, both in terms of my stage of life, and also in terms of just what's happening in the world. And then I think, so there was, maybe some, more outward focused, service oriented sort of ideals there. But then I think, frankly, part of it was for me was honestly a self-imposed rite of passage. I knew that I didn't feel like a man, and I don't fully unpack that. I don't entirely know why that is. I felt like if I go and if I serve in the military and I serve in a combat unit and I serve in a unit like the Rangers, that pretty much checks a lot of boxes. And that's a shortcut for I know that I am good enough, that I am in the brotherhood of men, whatever that means. And so for me, I think it was both of those things kind of happening concurrently, where I just felt like I had to. And it was just something, eventually it became something that I just absolutely couldn't shake, where I felt like if I didn't do it, I was just going to bust. And so that's what I did. I enlisted, and 3 weeks after I graduated with my bachelor's, I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, starting basic training.
And then just to kind of walk us through this quickly, you completed the Ranger indoctrination program, became a member of the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. And so in November of 2003, you're 22 years old and you're assigned to the same platoon as Kevin Tillman. And people might not know who Kevin Tillman is, but his brother, I think a lot of people will recognize this name, Pat Tillman. And when Pat's name comes into the picture, I think a lot of people flash back to, certainly he was an NFL player with the Arizona Cardinals, and a lot of people remember him leaving his football career to go serve his country after 9/11, but also him dying in combat. And we'll get into that story in just a second, but I want you to maybe share a little bit of the first time you met Pat Tillman, some interactions that you had with him before being deployed out to Afghanistan.
Yeah, so I got to 2nd Ranger Battalion, which is at Fort Lewis, Washington, in November of 2003. The battalion had just gotten back from deployment to Afghanistan, and it's a pretty. I mean, we've seen movies, whether it's SEALs or Rangers or whatever. The hazing sort of just continues in different permutations as you're a new guy in that unit. Yeah. And so that's sort of that's what's going on. Like, on the one hand, you've accomplished something in terms of just getting in, but at the same time, you've literally accomplished nothing because you're new and you don't know which way is up. And so, the first time the company is back, people are just scurrying around trying to turn in weapons and check boxes administratively and get the heck out of there for leave. And we were standing there, we being myself and the other new guys who had just been assigned to Alpha Company. And this big dude, big relative to most guys who are in regiment. Most guys in regiment look much more like they just came from the soccer pitch than they do from an NFL backfield. Right. Just because of the nature of the work. It's just a lot of high intensity cardio, and you'd have to eat a ridiculous amount of calories and stay in the weight room all the time to try and keep any weight on. And so, we're standing there, all kind of skinny and pathetic looking, just trying not to be noticed, waiting for our platoon assignments. And that's kind of the weird thing. It's like the a little, I don't know, it's a little bit like jail. I've never been in jail, but it's a little bit like like until you're owned by somebody, you're kind of just free reign. People can kind of mess with you and do whatever they want. And so we were waiting to get our assignments to see what platoon we would go to. And, people were messing with you and, you're just trying not to be noticed. And this big guy was sitting there and he was reading, well, he had in front of him, he was sitting at, it's sort of like if there was a concierge desk at a Ranger company, that was the desk. It's called the CQ desk. And so he was on CQ duty and he was sitting there and he had a copy of the Economist magazine sitting in front of him on the desk, which I thought was curious. And then he was reading very intensely a book that I believe was on the a selection for the Oprah Winfrey Book Club called Tuesdays with Maury.
Yeah, I remember that book.
Yeah, which was also pretty odd to see somebody in uniform at a Ranger company reading that. Yeah. And so I'm kind of taking that in, and he noticed us, and he stood up, and a big smile broke out across his face, and he extended his hand, shook all of our hands, which had not happened from anybody at regiment. And he just said, "Congratulations." He said, "You guys did so good getting here." He said, "I'm Pat. And what's going on? Can I help you get squared away?" And then essentially he and his brother Kevin, sort of, if we would have had bags to take, I think they would have taken our bags for us. But they just, they were just, that was my first time I met Pat. And that welcoming, pretty unassuming way that they operated wasn't confined to me. That's just kind of who they were.
Did you know who he was before that? Were you a football fan?
I was. I did not, and yet I was a football fan. I grew up in high school. I was a sports junkie, ESPN junkie, and what have you. And then in college, I didn't have cable, I didn't have a TV, and I was working and doing school at the time. And so I really just sort of, I just wasn't paying attention. I had vaguely remember hearing about some guy who left the NFL, but I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. And I don't think I could have told you his name, that's maybe kind of sad, but I just wasn't following it. So I didn't have much, if any, build up to him being a symbol of something. He was just a really nice guy who, was in the unit. So
where's faith, Stephen, during your early time in the Army? Are you able to kind of practice your faith and stay close to the Lord and stay grounded in your faith, or was that a very difficult thing for you before being deployed?
Yeah, it's regardless of your faith orientation, it's hard just because the environment you're in is hard. It's hard work. It doesn't lend itself to community. You get yelled at a lot, and so that just in general, it's a little bit harder on the spirit, I suppose. So there was that. In retrospect, in leading up to deployment, who I was as a follower of Jesus was very much, you could view it through different lenses, but I think one lens that's helpful is, we're all familiar, a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, familiar with the story of the two sons or the story of the Prodigal Son.
Sure.
And I think leading up to deployment, I was a dead ringer for the older son, that I had a seat at the father's table because I was checking all the right boxes. And at no point did I explicitly or consciously say this or think this, but my actions and behaviors, demonstrated this belief that I had earned my own righteousness and relationship, and that it was not. I understood grace to be the thing that kind of puts you over the top. No one's 100%, but you can be 90, 95, and you just need a little extra grace to just kind of finish it off. And so I had a very incomplete, broken, if not completely lacking understanding of grace leading up to that. And I think I viewed the Lord as much more of an insurance policy than anything else, where as long as I was trying hard and doing good, whatever that meant, however you want to draw those lines, which when we tend to draw those lines, we often magically find ourselves on the right side of those lines somehow, that we're on the good team and other people are not. And as long as I was trying hard and doing the right things, which weren't bad things, but as long as I was doing those things, then it was God's job to sort of hold up his end of the bargain and make sure that my life was, prosperous and successful, based on criteria that I had selected.
Right.
And that seemed to be affirmed throughout my college years, and at that point, had been affirmed in the success I'd experienced in the military. So that's kind of who, in a nutshell, that's kind of, I think, spiritually, from a faith standpoint, who I was, going into the spring of 2004.
Which is the perfect segue, because that's where I was going to take us next. In April of 2004, you're deployed to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And then April 22nd is the day, and you write, this is where a lot of this book takes us through, and the situation that occurred with Pat Tillman. Can you share kind of that day, give us a snapshot of what it was like and what took place, and then we'll go a little deeper?
Yeah. So we'd been, we arrived in country as part of a spring surge, that you have mountain passes between the tribal regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan that are opening up in the spring. And so, they sent us there to do raids and patrols along the border. We'd been doing that for a couple of weeks, and we'd had some of those patrols were mounted on vehicles, and one of our vehicles had broken down. And the long and short of it was, by the time we got to April 22nd, we were at a place where our platoon was being commanded to do two things simultaneously. One was get the broken down vehicle back to a hardball road, an actual blacktop road, which was a number of hours drive from where we were. Where we were at, you wouldn't dare call them roads. It was just, wadis in the middle of mountains. And so we were asked to do that. And also we had fallen behind schedule because we had a broken vehicle, and there was other objectives that higher command wanted us to clear. And so, long story short, our platoon leader was essentially ordered to do both of those things at the same time, which necessitated splitting the platoon, which he did at his own, not of his own volition. He did it because he was ordered to do it. He didn't want to do it. And so our platoon was split, and we initiated movement on April 22nd as dusk was setting in, which was not ideal for a lot of reasons. And our element, our half of the platoon, had been tasked with escorting this broken down vehicle back to a hardball road. And the other element, which included Pat, had been tasked with going and clearing this objective. And so we initiated movement, and the radio communication between both elements quickly was lost just because of geography and terrain. They couldn't talk to each other. And then we ended up taking a different route than we were planned on taking, and that wasn't communicated very well, if at all. We didn't really exactly know where we were going in terms of the rest of the platoon. And we were following the vehicle that I was in. I was manning an M240 Bravo machine gun. The vehicle that I was in was immediately following the broken down vehicle that was being hauled out by locals that we had hired. So there's a lot of things. There was a tremendous amount of frustration at the platoon level that why are we even doing this? Because we felt like a very heavily armed wrecking crew at that point, and just a lot of the normal operating procedures in terms of how you would move and what you would all those things were. It felt like the tail was wagging the dog a little bit as far as why we were doing what we were doing. So there was a lot of frustration in all of that, and ultimately we found ourselves following this local truck driver hauling a broken down vehicle through a very narrow canyon, and unbeknownst to us at the time that was the same canyon that Pat's part of the platoon had passed through just 20 minutes or so before. And so as we entered that canyon, we began to take enemy fire. IED exploded, and eventually small arms fire ensued. And so we fired back, and over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes, we worked our way out of the canyon. And as we exited the canyon, there was more muzzle flashes and fire to the right of our vehicle. And our vehicle's leader, staff sergeant, engaged that individual. He shot him and killed him. And then we basically keyed off of his fire, not having any other information to the contrary and not having any idea that there was friendlies in the area. We fired on that position as well. And it turns out, we found out, within the next, 24 hours, we realized that position we had fired on mistakenly was a friendly position, and they were responding. Pat's element was responding to what was happening behind them in the canyon, seeing a firefight erupt, and they positioned themselves on the ridgeline to try and support us, which also effectively put them in a position to blend into the landscape unintentionally, and it just created a perfect storm of circumstances. And so we fired there, and Pat was killed along with the Afghan soldier who was killed by our squad leader. And then 2 other members of the platoon were wounded. So that happened April 22nd, 2004. We all knew within 24 hours it was friendly fire. That was no secret. That was not being hidden. Right. And then we were back at the FOB, the following evening, and then that's when investigations began to ensue, and we began to kind of put together the pieces of exactly who was where and what happened.
There's got to be a whole lot that was going on. That's partially what this book is about. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. So tell us about, in essence, the real fight that you kind of had to wrestle through upon finding out that news and moving forward in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, you go into shock. You have no. If I had no context for 9/11, I certainly had no context for war, and I had no context for losing comrades, and I certainly had no context for potentially being an individual who hurt and or possibly killed a comrade on accident. So all of that, that's not in a John Wayne movie. That's not that's not hyped in the media's version of war that we're often presented with. And so I was in shock. We went back out. We did a couple investigations. There was some understanding of what went on. We all knew it was friendly fire. We didn't exactly know, and to this day we don't know who was exactly responsible for Pat's death, but it was pretty evident that it was, one of a couple of people, me being one of them. And we went back out on missions for another, 10 days or so. And so it felt like a false sense of closure. It was a false closure. Unbeknownst to us, there was a different narrative of Pat's death being told back home, and all manner of things that just set everybody up for failure in terms of just making a bad situation even worse. And then we got home, and ultimately that's when the truth began to circulate amongst the family that what they had been told about how Pat had died was not actually how he died, and so that just kind of blew the whole thing open again. Myself and 4 others were ultimately dismissed from the Rangers. We were released for standards, is the term, and sent to the big Army. There were no doors in the Army that were closed to us other than serving the Ranger Regiment. And so I left that summer of 2004, and I was frankly kind of happy to, just because I was kind of over it and just thought getting distance. I mean, don't get me wrong, if I did not want to leave regiment, and at the same time, just with how it was, I was happy to kind of put some distance between myself and that event. And within a few months of that, I started, the shock started wearing off, and I started, exhibiting, symptoms of, what some would call post-traumatic stress. Hypervigilance, depression, anxiety, nightmares, etc. And, I started self-medicating with alcohol, just trying to, grapple with really the spiritual wounds of the wounds that had taken place in relationship laterally or horizontally between people that I was in relationship with and served with. Those relationships were broken, and there was guilt and shame that I was carrying from my role in that brokenness. So there was horizontal disintegration of relationship that was causing woundedness, and then that ultimately leads to vertical deterioration of relationship between, myself and my Creator, where he failed to hold up his end of the bargain. I thought, doing my best and trying my hardest, and here I'm left in that situation. And why? What's the point? Because it feels like you're just sitting in the middle of a blast radius, and you've got rubble 360 degrees around you. Yeah. And if God was supposed to be your insurance policy against suffering, you'd kind of like your premiums back.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I should have been partying and not going to church. I could have slept in a lot if this is what's going to happen.
Right.
What's the point? And so I was very bitter, very angry, very motivated. I felt like the key was doubling down on my own self-reliance. And so the key was to put more accomplishment between myself and the failure of April 22nd. And I didn't need God for that. And so I walked away from the Lord and focused on earning my MBA and biding my time in the military and getting out, intent on being a quote unquote good person, because I didn't need God for that. And I couldn't trust him. I couldn't trust anybody else. And that's the road that I chose.
Well, it's 15 years now when you look back on that incident, and there's so much to dive deeper in, I guess, walking away from the Lord. I even think the process of forgiveness is something I wanted to kind of get into with you a little bit. Can you take us through that? Because there's a forgiveness that you have to walk through from your own self, that you have to forgive yourself for that, and then forgiveness from others and with relationships that may have spiraled, like you said, into a broken state. Tell us about what you've learned and what you are learning through the process of forgiveness.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think that it's essential. I think sometimes we treat forgiveness as though, it's this this luxury good that, if you can afford it or see clear to do it, that's great. That's cute. Congratulations. It is oxygen. It is essential. Because we live in a broken world with broken humans, and if we are not forgiving and accepting forgiveness, it's the same as not exchanging, oxygen and carbon dioxide. I mean, you die. Yeah. And so I'm continuing to learn the essential nature of that. That forgiving the self is not about some sort of self-image overhaul, that if I can just love myself enough, I can forgive myself. That's not necessarily, at least for me, that's not necessarily the pathway to that. We are lovable because of who made us, and because we're made in the image of the divine, and we're the only creatures on this earth where that is the case. And so, unlike both of the two sons in that story, the older and the younger son, neither of them understood that they had a seat at the table because that they always had a seat at the table, that their identity was not what they had done or failed to do. And so when that is our identity, then we are able to freely accept the grace and mercy that's given to us. And when we're freely accepting the grace and mercy that's given to us by Jesus, then we can do the same thing with other people, because it's not about me. It's not about my ego. It's not about my agenda. It's not about my rights. And it doesn't mean that forgiveness precludes consequences. Right. I think that's the other thing too, is sometimes we think, well, if I forgive somebody, it means that I don't hold them accountable. That is not true. So we can, in fact, one of the most unloving, indifferent things that we can do with people is not hold them accountable, and so or not be held accountable. And so I think that's it's a beautiful conundrum, because the forgiveness that's offered to us through the gospel is a both and reality. It is the reality that your sin and your depravity is right here front and center. We're not shaving any harsh edges off of it. And at the same time, all you have to do is ask, and it's gone, and there's a fresh slate. And that is the spirit of generosity that the Lord has for us, and that is the spirit of generosity that we are invited into with other people. When you're operating that way, it actually makes it easier to have honest, hard conversations about how people are hurting you, or about how you're hurting them, because then it's not an affront to your identity. Your identity is secure, but your behavior is not great. So we need to have that conversation. So there's so much. I fail at that all the time because I'm selfish and I'm prideful, and people annoy me, and I want them to behave in ways that are agreeable to me.
Right.
And so I have the opportunity to ask for forgiveness frequently, particularly since I'm married and have 2 daughters. And so I'm not lacking for that opportunity, and they're very gracious with me in that.
Absolutely. Stephen Elliott's our guest here on the podcast. Steve, what brought you back to God? Take us through, in a nutshell, how you were able to kind of recognize and realize all of the things you just stated in terms of the beauty of the gospel and bringing you back to the Lord.
It's probably 2 things. One is I can see his pursuit and I can see his provision in terms of relationships over the very dark times that I can't explain. I don't know why he pursued me in the ways that he did. And frankly, pain, suffering. I spent pretty much, about 10 years, 9 years, more or less, having left the faith. And I spent another few years after that, still pretty sick and still working through a lot of stuff. And so it was kind of a 12-year journey from 2004 to sort of emerging from kind of a long, dark tunnel. And I think a lot of that, I don't know, and it kind of doesn't matter if I know or not, I guess, but I don't think it had to be 12 years. I don't think that was the medicine that God somehow prescribed for me. Right. That's just how much crap and pain I was willing to put up with before I said, I need help, and I cannot fix myself. I cannot heal myself. Both from a spiritual standpoint, but even from a relational standpoint. I need people, and I need the Lord to help me. And I don't have anything good to offer in return. And that is for an A-type, self-reliant sort of person. That's one of the most horrifying places to find yourself. Yeah. But I had to hurt and I had to suffer long enough before I was willing to extend a hand and say, I'm hopeless. And that's the point at which hope entered the story.
I think many people might be asking and wondering the question about contact with the Tillmans, and you talked about forgiveness and extending it, certainly forgiveness from God. But how long did it take you to make contact with the Tillmans or try to connect with them? And I know, this whole process of going public, there's some pretty cool, poignant moments in there of you being able to have that connection with them. So take us through the connections with the Tillmans and just kind of walking through all of this with them.
Yeah, it took me 12 years. I mean, I was essentially afraid and was operating from a sense of self-preservation because I was wounded. And I wrapped my self-preservation around, well, I don't want to bother them. Yeah. And so I just assumed that I would be among the last people in the world that, they would ever want to hear from. And, which isn't fair, by the way. I mean, that's not, even if that's true, that's not fair to assume that of somebody else. And so, and I assumed that I would never, when I left the Army, I joined a big wealth management firm and, things were ticking along fine on paper. And it was basically just put as much road between you and what happened and, don't talk about it and just pretend it didn't occur. So, yeah, it wasn't until 2016 that, I had reached out and had contact with the family that was immediately reciprocated in a very, very gracious way. And maybe that time needed to pass before that was possible. I don't know. But yeah, I think there's there's far more that we as human beings have in common in our brokenness than there is that should make us enemies. And I'm just really grateful that my very late fumbling, sort of reaching out, was met with a tremendous amount of grace. And so yeah, I never would have dreamed that was possible, but that's my problem. So,
yeah. Well, Stephen Elliott's our guest here on the podcast. A couple more questions with Stephen. So you have this book. It's called War Story. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. It's very open and transparent. I've written a book myself, trying to be as transparent as I could in my book. And I wonder for you, what led you to want to write a book like this and put this out there publicly? And then what the main message is that you hope to convey as people pick up the book and read it.
Yeah, it was a process. It wasn't until 2014 that I was approached by anybody in the media to talk about it, and even at that point, it was a non-starter. Yeah. And so, but we decided to do interviews with ESPN's Outside the Lines in 2014, and then I kind of thought that was the end of it. And we were approached by some folks to say, "Hey, had you ever thought about writing this down?" And we sort of took some time and just took the temperature of what were people hearing from the ESPN pieces? Like, what was the takeaway from that sort of foray into the public realm? And the takeaway was largely like, thank you, from military and civilians alike, because, one of the greatest lies of the enemy that we're told is that you're alone. That the pain that you feel and that maybe you have caused, nobody else could understand you. And if they knew you, they would reject you. And so there's a lot of folks that, have contacted me and just said, thank you for talking about it. Thank you for talking about just depression, anxiety. Thank you for talking about these things, because we're struggling with it as well. And so that sort of just led to, a multi-year journey to figure out, how to do all that. And then ultimately, I sat down last January and wrote the story down. And so yeah, it was, I think, feeling like the main question we had to answer for ourselves, and even, in 2014 when we did the ESPN piece, was why?
Right.
There is plenty of reality TV shows that you can tune into and get your fix of whatever drama that you want. So if we're going to go and actually have this conversation about an event, what's the pivot? What's the point? And so, we felt and have come to see that the point is that nothing changes in our world without story. I can show you statistics on veteran suicide. I can show you statistics on divorce. I can show you statistics on all manner of things that cognitively are troubling with respect to how mental health is viewed and or treated in our military and veteran societies. And that cognitive awareness is unlikely to catalyze change, because absent personal connection within the context of story, they're just facts and figures. And so we've come to believe that, not that this is a story to end all stories, that if this story matters, it matters precisely because it's ordinary. Not because it's unique. Yeah. The only thing unique about it that makes it somewhat of a media phenomenon is its attachment to Pat. Other than that, the world is full of people who have been hurt and who have hurt one another and are trying to figure out how to heal and how to move on. And so our hope is in writing the story that we can put that story in service of catalyzing change within the mental health arena for active duty military. There's a number of specific reforms that we think would be really helpful and meaningful in closing gaps as to how the military approaches mental health. And some of those gaps are very evident in just what I experienced, not because anyone was malicious, but just the military culture is not particularly adept at dealing with the unseen wounds of war. And yet those are just as deadly, if not more so, than the ones that we can see. So our hope is in telling that story that we can move the needle forward at a macro policy level, and then at a micro personal level. Everyone, I mean, that's on the title of the book. Everyone has a war story, military or civilian. If we're on this planet long enough, we're going to have our scars. And so I think that narrative can be helpful for folks that are trying to pick up the pieces from those fights.
100% of the author's proceeds for this book will be donated to serving the mental health needs of the military community, and the book is called War Story by Stephen Elliott. Steve, this has been great talking to you, and I really appreciate your willingness and openness to tell your story. I believe in that too. The more we tell stories, the more it helps other people open up to know that they're not alone, and that they can hopefully enter into a place of healing and moving forward in their own lives. Last question here for you, and we ask this to all of our guests. This is an interesting question, kind of knowing your story and where you came from, but I wonder what you're learning from God right now in the season of life that you're in. What is the Lord teaching you? It's 15 years since that day in April of 2004, and where you are now, married with a couple of girls. What's the Lord been teaching you right now?
One day at a time. Not in like a heavy way, but just in a we slip so easily into the position of first mover that whatever our ambitions or whatever the things that we feel responsibility for, I have to be the one to make it happen. I have to be the one to make my marriage work, be a good parent, make things happen on the job, whatever it is. And that's not a burden or a load that any of us were designed to carry. And I constantly get invited into the truth that I get to work, I get to labor, I get to participate in the work that the Lord is doing. But He's the first mover, not me. And so when I allow myself to sort of walk that out, there's a tremendous amount of freedom there. And when I don't, it's not very fun. But that's increasingly a lesson that I'm trying my best to learn these days.
Stephen Elliott's our guest here on the podcast. The book is called War Story. It's available. It went on sale May 21st and is available everywhere books are found. Stephen, thanks for being here on the podcast. Really appreciate you. Thank you again for your service, and wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Powerful conversation there with Stephen Elliott, the author of the book War Story. The book released May 21st, and 100% of the author's proceeds will be donated to serving the mental health needs of the military community. Powerful story. Many thanks to Stephen for being here on Sports Spectrum. We also want to thank our sponsors, Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportsspectrum and check out the website there. You'll see a list of children waiting to be released from poverty. You can go to the website, pray about it, possibly make room at the dinner table for one more, and then make that decision to release a child from poverty. It's $38 a month, and it provides food, education, medical care, and vocational training. It's all of it done in Jesus' name. Consider sponsoring a child today through Compassion. Go to the website, compassion.com/sportsspectrum, and consider releasing a child from poverty. Many thanks to Stephen Elliott, and thanks to you for listening. Check out our website, sportsspectrum.com. Check out our content on social media as well, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search Sports Spectrum. We're also on YouTube. You can subscribe there. And definitely, if this is the first time you've heard this podcast, click the subscribe button on whatever app you're listening to this podcast on. That allows you to never miss an episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast. And we really are just excited that you tuned in, that you checked us out. And this interview was a very powerful one with Stephen Elliott, and a little different than the ones that we've done before. Many of the interviews that we do are with athletes or former athletes or coaches or people in the sports industry. And Stephen isn't an athlete or a person in the sports industry currently, but his story is powerful because it does intersect sports, but it really brings the name of Jesus back into the conversation. And that's what we do here at Sports Spectrum. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time with a brand new episode. Tell all your friends about Sports Spectrum. Have a great rest of your day. We love you guys. This is the Sports Spectrum Podcast.